Hi, and welcome to this lecture on Introduction to Assessment for courses ADPM 001 and ADP 7001. There are four main learning outcomes for this topic. So after this topic, you should be able to, firstly, define the purposes of assessment, secondly, understand the difference between formative and summative assessment, thirdly, examine the place of assessment in student learning, and fourth, give useful feedback on student work. So what is assessment? There's no one agreed definition of assessment, sadly. That would make it simple. But there are a couple of sample ones that show two different ways of approaching it. Roundtree states that assessment in education can be thought of as occurring whenever one person, in some kind of interaction, direct or indirect, is conscious of obtaining and interpreting information about the knowledge and understanding or abilities of the other person. And Gibbs, in a slightly later definition, says that assessment is a wide range of methods for evaluating pupil performance and attainment, including formal testing and examinations, practical and oral assessment, classroom-based assessment carried out by teachers, and portfolios. So just these two definitions alone provide an interesting set of views about assessment. For Roundtree, assessment is for gaining information for one person about another person. And for Gibbs, assessment is an evaluative tool. So it's not just about assessing, but also about evaluation. So there's something that you do with the information. And both of these tend to assume that the purpose of assessment is solely for the teacher. So if I assess you, the benefit goes to me. But actually there are lots of different ways of defining assessment, and for quite a lot of the ways of defining assessment you could argue that assessment should benefit the student as well. So it could be a way of providing information, but not necessarily just for the teacher. So have a think about what you define as assessment, what assessment is for, what it does, and how it might be carried out. So why do we assess? Student and teachers famously don't always agree on the purposes of assessment, but here are just some possible uses of assessment, and the possible uses might vary depending on your circumstances. Firstly, you might assess to show students how well they're performing. So this relates to what I said before about who is the information for in assessment. You might want to show students relative to each other, but you might not. Again, that will depend on your style as a teacher, and it might depend on what you think is best for your students as well. Sometimes it can be very harmful for a student to know that they're doing worse than everyone in their class, for example, or even to know that they're doing better than everyone in their class. But other times you might want to give a class ranking. For grading and final classification of degrees, that's really important because then it gives the student something to carry away with them. To say, I got first or I got an upper second. This has meaning, and I think if you took that away, students would certainly be very disappointed. They wouldn't feel that their degrees had as much value. An obvious reason, and one that a lot of teachers go to first, is to show staff how well students are performing, so that you can see how your teaching is working and see if there's anything you need to change, perhaps. To show the quality of the course and institution as well. So institutions tend to have a vested interest in how assessment is carried out and how well it makes the institution look, which can sometimes put pressure on teachers. An important reason is to meet students' expectation that there will be assessment, which in a sense kind of sounds like a cycle. Students expect assessment, so we give assessment, and so therefore they expect assessment further down the line. But it is an interesting one. So even though students might moan about assessment, they expect that there'll be some. And if you were to take that away, they might not be as pleased with a lack of assessment as they themselves might predict that they would be. Assessment can motivate students. We'd hope that it's not the only motivation for students, but it can be an important motivation, particularly in subjects where the students don't always enjoy it or don't always find it that thrilling. You can also assess to provide feedback to the students. So it can be you can use formal assessment as just a structure, if you like, within which to provide feedback. so that you have an organised way of making sure everyone gets roughly the same level of feedback. You can assess to help students correct mistakes in their understanding. This is particularly useful in informal assessments, in-class assessments perhaps, or kind of pop quizzes, just to make sure that everyone's on the same page regarding the facts. And similarly, it can show whether students are ready to progress. So if you don't pass your first year of a degree, that means you're not going to do very well in the second year. So you need to work better on getting to grips with those facts in the first year. And that may mean that you go to summer school, or it may mean that you repeat a year again. But ultimately, it's flagging up that you're not ready to progress to the second year if you fail the first year. And finally, it's to help students diagnose their faults and weaknesses. So not just to show them how well they're performing, but also to show how they can improve. And hopefully to give some direction to them on how to improve. And this is something that we'll return to in discussing what makes good quality feedback. So what makes a good assessment? There are 6 objectives here that are generally applicable. But there will also be specific things that you want to achieve whenever you're designing an assessment. So firstly, the assessment should be fit for purpose. So it should achieve the objectives for which you've designed it. And this seems really obvious. Obviously, the assessment should be fit for purpose, but it's just worth thinking about. And even if you haven't designed an assessment, it can be really interesting to kind of say, okay, why was this assessment designed? What was it designed to do? And do I think it's fulfilling that purpose? Even if you don't have the power to change an assessment, it can be useful just to reflect on those issues, because it's surprising how often people just keep an assessment the way it is because it's always been the way it is and because it's uncomfortable to change. An assessment should be reliable, so it would get the same result if repeated in the same circumstances. That's something that's really difficult to measure, but it means it shouldn't be too circumstance dependent. So if it would repeated on the same students of similar ability, it would get the same result. And it should accurately represent the strengths and weaknesses of your students. And again, that's sometimes something you can only think about after the fact. But again, if it's not your assessment, it's still interesting to look at it and go, actually, is this representing the weaknesses and strengths of the students? Or are the students that I think are strong in my subject not doing so well? What strengths and weaknesses is it measuring, and what strengths and weaknesses should it be measuring? Related to that, an assessment should be valid. It should measure what it's supposed to measure. It shouldn't measure students' abilities in something that's not being measured. So in practical terms, this means just actually when you're designing the assessment, thinking about what form the assessment might take, what you might ask in an exam, what do I actually want to measure? Do I want to measure students' ability to draw diagrams or to analyse diagrams? Do I want to measure students' ability to write essays or to respond to literary texts? What is it exactly that I want to measure? The principles on which students are assessed should be as objective as possible. This is actually quite difficult to guarantee, particularly in humanities subjects where you have a lot of written essays, and what makes a good essay can be really subjective. People have different opinions on it. And in some senses you can't correct for that entirely, but you can make the mark scheme clear if you have that power. You can make the questions as clear as you possibly can. And it's just a useful objective to have in mind. Again, even if you don't necessarily have a choice on these things, you can think about, well, are the assessments that objective, or are they completely subjective or opinion based? Is the difference between a first and an upper second very good and excellent? Those are incredibly subjective things, for example. So it should be relevant as well. The assessment should assess qualities that are relevant to the course and its learning outcomes. So if one of your learning outcomes is students will be able to draw neat diagrams within a limited time range, then they should be assessed on that, not on their ability to analyse diagrams, unless that's also one of the learning outcomes. And again, it's surprising how often this is not the case, and you find students undertaking assessment that they didn't really know they were supposed to learn, and that assesses skills that they may or may not have, but that they didn't learn in the course. And finally, and very importantly, it should be clear. So what you have to do to pass the assessment should be clear to the students, because otherwise assessment is just done by chance, it's not reliable, it's not valid, and it's not fit for purpose. So clarity is really important. And again, that's something you can do something about even if you haven't designed the assessment, is try and make it as clear to students as possible what to do to pass. And if it's not clear to you as a teacher what students should do to pass, then that's a problem with the assessment, and that's something that you can reflect on. So there are a few different types of assessment, some more common than others. There's a contrast, one of the most important contrasts is between formative and summative assessment. So formative assessment is usually undertaken during learning, it's designed to help students improve, and one example might be a test taken in the middle of a module, so it would test students' knowledge so far, and the feedback to the students would be letting them know how well they've done in certain areas, what they need to work on, and what they don't necessarily need to work on so much. Summative assessment, by contrast, is done after learning, and so it's designed to provide information on how a student has done. So that might be assessment at the end of the module. Now, it's very difficult to tell sometimes whether assessment is formative or summative, or in fact both. So assessment can be formative and summative at the same time. So it might be an end module assessment, which seems summative, this is how you've done on this module, but it also will be formative in the sense that it shows the student how they're doing on the degree in more general terms, so perhaps how they're doing on a particular skill, a particular type of literary text, or a particular aspect or subdiscipline. So things can be formative and summative at the same time. So I find people getting in a tears about, whether is this formative or is this summative? As long as you know what the two are, it can be both at the same time. That's completely normal. So the other three are sort of ways of judging assessment. So criterion-based assesses unspecified criteria such as skills, knowledge or behaviour, and students are assessed on how well they meet criteria, and they might meet criteria at different levels, and that's how we assess in the PGCAP and SILT modules. You may remember I've given you a lot of information about the assessment criteria for the two assignments for this module and talked about the levels at which you might meet criteria. That's because this is criterion-based assessment. Another way that you can assess students is norm-based assessment. So that's when students' work is judged in relation to the rest of the class. So it might be decided beforehand that 60% of the class will pass, 40% of the class will fail. And so the student's grade therefore depends on how well they've done in relation to the norm. This is often done in the US, and it's known as grading on a curve. So you kind of know in advance roughly how many people will get A's, B's and C's. And this is one that people often debate the fairness of. Is it fair that in a year where everyone is clever, for example, you're less likely to do well because it will be norm-based and it will depend on how well everyone else does. But it could also be said to be fairer. So if you get a harder paper in a particular year, because that does happen, some years a paper is easy, some years a paper is hard. If you get a hard paper one year, then that kind of compensates for that a bit because everyone will do slightly worse, but the curve will stay the same. Finally there's ipsative assessment, which is less common but a very interesting way of thinking about assessment. So work is only judged by comparison to a student's own earlier work, and the mark is based on how much the student has improved from before. This is quite self-referential and quite time-consuming, but incredibly valuable to students. It's not something we tend to use in university because often external forces demand that we give certain grades, so we can't say, a student just improved in comparison to her own work. So that's really great because they need to know how well a student's going to do in comparison to the other 100 people who are applying for the same job. So they want to know a less self-referential level of achievement, but it can be a very interesting way, just even if you don't do it, of thinking about assessment. Particularly in kind of earlier stages of a degree where the focus might be on kind of improving people and making sure they have development goals rather than judging on how well they're doing. So there are lots of different assessment methods. Just take a minute to have a look at the few that I've listed here. Some of them you may never use. Professional discussion, for example, you might never use that. But some of them you might use quite a lot. Some of them you may have experience but not seen as assessment, such as observations or group projects. And they've all got their own advantages and disadvantages, and the advantages and disadvantages of these methods really will depend on the particular circumstances that you're in, what you're trying to teach, and who you're trying to teach it to. So which method best suits your content? Do you want to assess how well students can remember things? In that instance, maybe a closed exam is good, but if you want to know how students use knowledge but you don't necessarily care that they can't remember it, an open exam might be more useful. You might want to test a student's writing skills, so essays and dissertations are a good method there, but you also might want to test how well they can speak, so oral presentations might be better there, or even professional discussion. So which method will give you the best information? That's really the question you should be asking when choosing a method for you, your students and external bodies. So there'll be different stakeholders in each kind of assessment. So it might just be about you and the students if it's an informal mid-module assessment. But if we're looking at summative assessment, particularly at the end of a degree course, there's going to be external bodies and the university itself will have a stake in how assessment is carried out. So they might want reliable results. So they'll want maybe something like an essay or a dissertation or something that can be marked reliably, and quite possibly something that can be marked on an individual basis rather than a group basis. So peer assessment might not be the best one for a kind of final degree mark. But have a think. Explore different methods, even if you don't necessarily want to explore using different methods in your teaching, and perhaps you don't have the power to change assessment methods. It can be useful just to think about, okay, what would happen if I picked simulations? How would I use simulations to assess in my particular subject? What would be the advantages and disadvantages? Would it work? So just a sort of counterfactual exploration, if you will. Even if you can't actually design and implement an assessment, it can be really useful to just kind of think through the process and explore how these different assessment methods would mesh with the concrete details of the teaching that you actually do. Feedback. Good feedback is something that most of you will probably have the power to do. And it can make a real difference to how students feel their module has gone. And good feedback can be the difference between good and bad evaluations. And it can go a long way as well to making up for bad results. So even if a student does badly on an assessment, if you give them the right feedback, that mitigates the effect a bit. They might still be disappointed in how well they've done, but they're much more likely to use it productively rather than use it to resent you or resent the subject. So Nicol and Macfarlane-Dick have come up with 7 principles of good feedback practice, which I think pretty much sum up what good feedback looks like. So firstly, good feedback helps clarify what good performance is. So it might be goals, criteria, or expected standards. So this goes back to what I was saying about assessment being objective. It's no good just kind of saying, oh, that wasn't very good. I didn't like what you did there, because you don't get a sense of what was actually expected. All you know is that what you did wasn't very good. So if you can say, well, what you did wasn't very good, but here's what would have been good, that helps a student kind of think about where they want to get to. It's not just about doing better, it's about doing something specifically different. Related to that, good feedback facilitates the development of self-assessment or reflection in learning. So reading good feedback will make a student want to think about how they've done. And this is a difficult skill, because if a student's done badly in assessment, what they'd really like to do, as I'm sure most of us would like to do, is just forget about it. So you have to go against their completely natural human instinct. But if you can, it's really worthwhile. And a good way to do this is just to keep referring back to what students did in the essay. So when you did X, this meant that you did not fulfill criteria A. or you are really good in class but not so good in this particular assessment, so there's a skill differential here. Just kind of making sure you tailor the feedback to the student and that it always relates to concrete things that they can think about what they actually do. Thirdly, good feedback delivers high quality information to students about their learning. So it should be detailed, it should be relevant, it should show that you've really connected with what a student's been writing. And I know that's incredibly difficult to do when you've got loads and loads to mark and you've got loads of other things to do. And I know that marking is one of the massive time sucks of academia. And sometimes you won't be able to give high quality information if you're marking 100 papers in a week. There will be a limit, but as far as you can, just even thinking about the quality of information that this is giving to students. Am I assessing students a lot and giving them a lot of low quality information? Would it be better to assess them maybe less and give them high quality information? And again, even if you don't have a choice about the assessment methods and you don't really have a choice about the quality of information you give students, you can think about the quality of information and kind of say, well, actually, does this give reliable information to students? Is this something they can use? Fourthly, good feedback encourages teacher and peer dialogue around learning. That's really important. One way to do that is to make sure that even if you deliver feedback in a written format, you follow that up with a face-to-face meeting so that the has a way to respond about their learning, so they can say, oh, I didn't think I had done as badly as I have. Here's what I thought about it. This really surprised me. Not so much so that the student can argue with you about your grade, because that's something that you shouldn't have to deal with, but more that so that you can talk to the student, get a sense of maybe why they did, what their next steps are, and just get a conversation going. And ideally students will share with their peers as well, but this is something that is particularly difficult, especially when students want to save face and they haven't done very well. But if you can see it happening, that's a really good sign. Good feedback, really importantly, should encourage positive motivational beliefs and self-esteem. Even if the feedback is on how badly the student has done in an assignment. It can be really difficult, I know, but try to find something positive, even if it's only like you write very clearly, and the reason may be because they don't put enough detail in, or your diagrams are neat. Obviously not completely contrived, but that can be, even the smallest bit of hope can make a student want to kind of put in place the corrections and the criticisms that you give. It can be the proverbial spoonful of sugar, let's say. Obviously, I'm not encouraging dishonesty or flattery, but it should make a student believe that they can make the improvements, rather than just making them feel hopeless or resentful. It should also, related to that, provide opportunities to close the gap between current and desired performance. So not just you're at A but you should be at B, but okay, you're at A right now, here's how you get to B, giving specific concrete things. And that could mean that the desired performance is not, say, a first. If a student's getting a third, you're not going to get them to a first from a third in one piece of feedback, but you might get them from a third to a lower second. So just making sure that gap is reasonable and giving them concrete things to try out in order to close that gap. And then once they've closed that gap, they'll be a little bit further along, so maybe another gap will open and the desired performance can move up. But just thinking about the fact that there is a gap and how students will be able to cross it can be really useful. And finally, good feedback should provide information to teachers as well. Especially if the person giving the feedback is not doing the teaching. So it can be used to help shape the teaching in the future, particularly on mid-module evaluations. And equally, your own feedback can provide you with information. If you are applying all these principles of good feedback, you should be able to read through them and then actually say, okay, everyone is misunderstanding this particular aspect of my course. How can I make things better? How can I shape my teaching to improve that? So those are 7 principles of good feedback. Have a think, and have a look at your feedback and see what you currently do and whether they actually fulfill those principles. Thanks for listening. Enjoy the resources on QM+, and I'll see you in your seminar or Blackboard Collaborate session.